Good afternoon. I'm Mark Juergensmeyer, the Director of the Global and International Studies Program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is one of the co-hosts of this event, along with the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, the Global Peace and Security Program, a whole bunch of other campus programs and community groups. We're very proud to sponsor this afternoon's event. We also want you to know that if you like your comfortable seats here in Campbell Hall, you can just stay where you are, because the next couple Sundays we have two outstanding speakers. Arianna Huffington will be here on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock to talk about her new book, Pigs at the Trough, How Corporate Greed and Political Corruption Are Undermining America. Give it to them, Arianna. And Ahmad Rashid, arguably the best journalist on Central Asia, in his outstanding book on the Taliban in Afghanistan, will be talking about his new book, Jihad, The Rise of Militant Islam in Central Asia, on Sunday afternoon, February 9th, right here in Campbell Hall. Well, now, folks, you are in for a great treat. We have an extraordinary speaker. No one has greater credibility to talk about the current situation in Iraq than America's ambassador to Iraq. At the time of the Desert Shield and shortly before Desert Storm, the last American ambassador to deal with Saddam Hussein, someone who knows him personally, who knows Iraq well, having lived there for 2.5 years as a part of the American mission to Iraq, and a person who has very strong ideas, opinions about the current involvement in Iraq. I'm not going to tip my hand and tell you what they are, but I can guarantee you will be interested in what Joe Wilson has to say. We're delighted to have Joe Wilson here with us, and we've asked Ambassador to formally introduce him, but I should say that we're especially delighted because not only is he a distinguished ambassador, he is also a distinguished alum of UCSB. The last time I think I saw Joe, yeah, that deserves a hand. I think the last time I saw Joe was over in Isla Vista. He had just, he was here with a new bride, and he was showing her around IV to let her know, the kind of housing that he had experienced at UCSB, and she was not impressed. But he was very proud, and this all goes to show that those of you undergraduates who are here, the next time you're standing with your plastic cup in the keg line in Isla Vista, look around you very carefully, because one of those guys or one of those girls may be one day a famous ambassador or a diplomat in the State Department and a representative of the United States government, as Joseph Wilson has been. I've asked Chancellor Yang, who knows Joe well as having made him a distinguished alumnus of the university, to formally introduce Joe and his talk. Chancellor Yang. Did I say Ambassador Yang? Chancellor Yang. I've just installed you in the American Diplomatic Corps. Hope you don't mind.
Thank you. Well, such a crowd. On behalf of our campus community, it is my great honor and a pleasure to welcome all of you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Joseph Wilson to our campus. First, I would like to especially thank Professor Mark Juergensmeyer for sharing his class time with us and giving us the opportunity to hear Ambassador Joe Wilson speak on such an important topic. Joe, I heard that the reason you came to UC Santa Barbara was because a friend told you to come and check out the SERV. And it must have impressed you, otherwise you wouldn't have been here. By the way, Joe is also a UCSB parent. His daughter, Sabrina, graduated from UCSB just last year. We are proud not only of our beaches, but that UC Santa Barbara is a world-renowned preeminent research university that offers a rich culture of interdisciplinary collaborations. We have intellectual resources to take part in active dialogues to unveil different perspectives and seek answers to the questions brought upon by the world we live in. We are also fortunate and proud that we have a rich and a diverse community of academic scholars. UCSB graduates have been at the forefront of the important arena of foreign policy and diplomacy. One such UCSB graduate is Ambassador Joe Wilson. Ambassador Wilson was honored with UCSB's Distinguished Alumnus Award in 1991. He is also a member of our National Campaign Committee, a small group of esteemed UCSB friends who work to encourage private support to advance the educational research and the service purposes of this university. Ambassador Wilson has been a distinguished and respected leader in our nation's government, serving as a member of the U.S. Diplomatic Service for over 22 years. His appointments included Special Assistant to President Clinton and the Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, Political Advisor to the Commander-in-Chief of United States Armed Forces Europe, and the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq, Bujumbura, Burundi, and Brazzaville, Congo. Joe served as United States Ambassador to Gabonese Republic and to the Democratic Republic of Sao Tome and Principe from 1992 to 1995. He was the acting ambassador to Iraq during Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and is proudly remembered as the last official American to meet with Saddam Hussein before the launch of Desert Storm. During Saddam's last meeting with Joe, he not only brought his political advisors, he also carried his pistol. In recent years, Joe has been in less stressful situation, I'll say, and active in strategic management and international business development as the CEO of J.C. Wilson International Ventures. Lately, he has been finding himself revisiting familiar issues and speaking frequently about the serious threat of military action against Iraq. He's currently adjunct scholar of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. A colleague of mine wrote, "For the university to fulfill its obligations to academic freedom and to intellectual development, it must provide a forum in which individuals and groups can advocate their views. It must assure an environment for civil discourse." So last year, in the wake of 9/11, UC Santa Barbara held a series of panel discussions. The series was one of the several efforts by our campus to create just this kind of space for public thinking. In the years since then, much has happened and much has been learned. This year, we are returning to the spirit of those discussions with a lecture series on global forces in the post-Cold War world. Through this series, we are embracing the university's free search for truth and its free expressions, while examining the important issues of the threat of war in Iraq. We very much appreciate your willingness, Joe, to visit your alma mater and to share your expertise, your wisdom, and your experience, and perhaps your humor with us in this timely fashion. Thank you for joining us.
Be kind not only to the fellow with the paper cup and the keg line, but also the guy who's pitched forward in the lawn next to the keg, because you never know where he may end up. So this is Campbell Hall. I vaguely remember being here, although, as Grace Slick said, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there, and I very definitely was there. I have never been on the podium. I've never worn a tie in Campbell Hall. And this could well be the first time I've worn shoes in Campbell Hall. We used to attend lectures here in between the beach, in between beach and Red Mountain Wine, I guess, basically. But my chair was right up there in the left aisle, up there in the dark, that lady who's sitting there in the dark. And you'll notice that seat slides down very nicely. You can get a nice, comfortable position there. And to this day, I cannot attend a lecture, unless I'm giving it, without falling asleep in about 10 minutes. So, 12 years ago, about this time, I was sitting in a lecture hall, and 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 I was sitting in a lec sitting in the White House, January 14th of 1991, sitting in the White House, briefing the President of the United States, then George Bush Sr., Vice President, the Secretary of State, Director of Central Intelligence, National Security Advisor, Chief of Staff, and sundry minions known as the War Cabinet. As an aside, Bill Kristol, one of the principal proponents for war in Iraq, was then Chief of Staff to the Vice President of the United States. He was not at that meeting. So that should tell you something about where he was in the loop at that time. I had just come out of Iraq after having not slept for about 7 months, having been responsible for dealing with significant issues related to war and peace and the lives and deaths of American citizens, of whom there were about 150 hostages in Saddam's hands, so-called human shields, and about another 150 that we were housing in diplomatic quarters, and a couple thousand Americans throughout the countries of Iraq and Kuwait. It had been a time of enormous stress, no sleep, terrible efforts trying to get Americans safe, not knowing whether we were going to get out, the 4 of us who were left in Baghdad after we finally did get all the hostages out. Flew back to Germany, flew back to Washington. The next morning, I was convoked to the Oval Office. I walk into the Oval Office. I'm sitting there briefing the President of the United States, suffering from jet lag, culture shock, and everything else you can possibly imagine, not having a clue of what I'm saying, just really running on pure adrenaline. And about 15 minutes into the briefing, I woke up. I kind of realized where I was. Here I was in the Oval Office. And I looked across, and there was Brent Scowcroft, then the National Security Advisor, and he was sitting sort of kitty corner. And he had his legal pad out, and he was taking notes. And my first conscious thought in the Oval Office with this august body of decision makers was, who would have ever thought that this hippie surfer from Santa Barbara would one day be sitting in the Oval Office briefing the President of the United States on war with Iraq, and the note taker would be this 3-star General National Security Advisor. So it just goes to tell you where you can end up if you get into a lot of trouble after you come out of here. At the time, of course, that we did Iraq, the Gulf War, there were a couple of other distinguished UCSB graduates who were occupying key positions. One was Barbara Bodine, who I'm sure you all know, who was down in Kuwait, and she was responsible for digging wells and maintaining the morale of an intrepid but embattled group of Americans who could not get out of the embassy compound. They were surrounded Alamo-style by the Iraqi troops. And to the north, there was another UCSB graduate named Mark Grossman, who went back to Turkey as ambassador and is now the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. So we were well represented. We had a couple of things in common. One was that we were from UCSB, and the other was that we were all here at the last time that there was a major significant military conflict in which the United States was involved. We were all here in the late 60s during the protests in Santa Barbara against the Vietnam War. And as I wrote to the Chancellor at that time, not unlike the Joan Collins song, sitting inside my office listening to Iraqi demonstrators outside the embassy chanting, "Down, down, Bush, down, down, Bush." I felt a little bit like the professors of that period must have felt with us outside their offices chanting "No more war" and all that sort of stuff. So I'd been on both sides at that time. So, Chancellor Yang, thank you very much for that warm introduction. Deling, so nice to see you again. You are such a wonderful couple, and you have done so much to turn this university from what it was when I was here, one of the top 2 or 3 party schools in the country, to what it is now, the home of 3 Nobel laureates, heroes like Barbara Bodine, as well as you quite correctly pointed out, a fine research institution of which we are all proud. Every opportunity I have back east where people like to tout their Ivy League credentials, I have a T-shirt that says how many Nobel Prizes have been won by UCSB relative to having been won by Harvard and Yale and Princeton and the other ones. I know you don't like to flaunt that. I do. Mark, thank you very much. It's good to be back out here. It's good to be amongst friends, and it's good to have an opportunity to engage in a discussion on this potential war with Iraq. Before I begin, let me also say that there are a number of friends and colleagues who were with me here when I was a student, and they're the ones who have the rotten tomatoes and the eggs. They're probably up there somewhere. They're the ones who were on John Ashcroft's list to liquidate before I run for political office, because they know just too much about me. But I want to talk today about what I think is a real dangerous road upon which we are embarking, and that is the road to war in Iraq. I titled, when Mark asked me, or when Leonard Wallach asked me what the title of my lecture would be, I suggested Disarmament or Conquest. Actually, I want to talk a little bit first about Conquest, which is the preferred route that seems to be being taken by the administration, and then offer up an alternate scenario, which would be focused principally on disarmament without the need to deploy 250,000 troops, occupy Iraq, destroy the government, and try and resurrect it as a thriving Middle Eastern democracy, as is the want of some of these people who are promoting and driving this particular policy. This is the second time in 12 years that we have gone to war with Iraq. 12 years ago, when I was in Baghdad, I was considered to be, in the then administration, one of the principal hawks. I felt then, and I feel now, that the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was a violation of the UN Charter. It was a violation of the Arab League Charter. It was a violation of the Iraqi draft constitution. And it was a rapacious land grab in which the lives of innocent Kuwaitis were sacrificed for the greater glory of Saddam Hussein and his regional ambition. It was worth our fighting against. It was worth the effort at that time to get together the international coalition and to drive Saddam from Kuwait. I was proud to be part of that effort, and to this day, I think that history will record that George Bush Sr. and his senior staff played their cards masterfully in developing the coalition and the international coalition to go in and root Saddam out of Kuwait. And one of the things that they did in so doing is they defined their objectives, and they defined their objectives as getting him out of Kuwait. They didn't mess around with this regime change stuff. They made it clear that we weren't going to go to Baghdad. They made it clear that we were going to abide by the United Nations Security Council resolution, and we were going to do things in a fashion that was consistent with the international law that had been established by the UN Security Council resolutions. This time it is not at all clear, one, that in the end we are even going to go to the United Nations to get the international support for what we intend to do, or two, if we do get it, that we will abide by it, and it will have far-reaching ramifications for our global leadership should we not do so. Let me say up front, as one who knows Saddam Hussein, he is a bad man. He is a loathsome individual. I met with him for 2.5 hours to discuss his invasion of Kuwait, and during those 2.5 hours, and he did attend the meeting with a gun, he did attempt to intimidate me. He had a number of different strategies to do so. In the end, he tried to cut the deal with the United States, and the deal that he offered was, you let me keep Kuwait. You do not respond unilaterally, and I will give you cheap oil and a steady supply of it, and I will serve as the policeman of the Gulf. But you let me keep Kuwait. Should you not accept the deal, he said to me, we will keep Kuwait anyway, and if you try and throw us out militarily, you do not have the political will nor the political stamina to suffer the deaths of 10,000 American soldiers in the sands of the Arabian Desert. We proved differently. In going into that meeting, Saddam Hussein has a rather interesting way of trying to assert dominance, which is already fairly easy. He's already a chief of state, and I don't know how many people here have actually met chiefs of state or met absolute dictators, but it can be pretty intimidating. I have met several, and even when I was first met Bill Clinton as a senior advisor, even though I had met predecessors and I'd met chiefs of state everywhere, it is still intimidating the first time. You get kind of choked up, you cotton mouth and everything, and after all, you're sitting there meeting one of the most powerful people in the country. With Saddam, he has some tricks that are designed to make that feel even stronger, that intimidation. One of the things that he does is he breaks that social space. So instead of talking to you from, say, 18 or 24 inches, he will take that extra step into you. And then he will fix you with this stare. And he's got very deep brown eyes, unblinking eyes. And you will have the exchange of niceties through a simultaneous translator before he extends his hand to shake hands with you. And then when he shakes hands with you, he drops his hand rather low, so that in order for you to take his hand after having had the stare-down contest with him, you have to bow, you have to look down to find his hand to shake it. And when that happens, of course, you're caught on Iraqi television as having essentially genuflected to the potentate. Now, I had learned this because I'd gone to one of these meetings and I'd said, you know, I'm not going to bow to this guy. I'm just going to look him in the eye like any good American and shake his hand and hell with it. I went back after the first meeting with him and turned on the television to see how it played to the Iraqi public, and there I was genuflecting to this guy. So the last time I met him, which was the day of our famous, our meeting, August 2nd or August 6th of 1990, the time came to shake hands with him, and I'm standing there. Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Yeah. All right, so I'm standing there with him, and we're staring at each other, and the translator's doing this, and time comes to shake hands, and I kind of look him right in the eye and just reach out and grab. Now, when I came back and I met with the senior leadership of both parties in Washington, I was in the office of the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley then. And I told Tom this story. And Tom's a big guy, about 6'4", 6'5", rather imposing. Anybody who's Speaker of the House is going to be imposing, except for maybe Denny Hastert. And Tom leans forward in his chair and he says to me, you mean to tell me you were this close to having Saddam Hussein by the blank? And this is in the Speaker's ornate office in the Capitol building. And you didn't go for it, and as a consequence, we had to send Norm Schwarzkopf and 500,000 of America's finest to get the job done. And 3 days later, he calls me up, and you know, you take a call from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he says to me, you know, I know what you told me about Saddam Hussein was in private and confidential, but I got to tell you, I was just at a meeting of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, Piffy Abbott's called. And the most senior people who review any sort of intelligence operations that the U.S. government might undertake. And he said, I just couldn't resist. I told them, and now it's all over town. You're in trouble. Saddam Hussein is a bad man. He has engaged in every sort of bad activity you could possibly imagine. He has, as his detractors have said, used chemical weapons in his war against Iran. He's used chemical weapons against Kurds, who are Iraqi Kurds. They were, of course, rising up against his regime. They were allied with the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War, but he used horrible weapons against them. He has a terrible human rights record. We used to report on it regularly. His human rights record included such things as killing his political opponents and then sending the bill for the bullets to the families. Virtually everything that you have heard his detractors say about him I can tell you from personal experience over there, are probably true, and in fact may be understated. He heads one of the two most horrible regimes in the world, the other one being North Korea. This is not a guy that you would want to invite over to dinner. In fact, the world will be far better off when he and his thugs are gone. The Arab world will heave a collective sigh of relief, as will our European allies, as will we, because nothing could be worse than Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq over the long term. After he goes, there may well be dislocation, there may well be civil war, there may well be ethnic strife, but over the long term, nothing could be worse than the regime of Saddam Hussein. The question is not whether Saddam Hussein is a good man or a bad man. The question is whether or not we are going to act in our vital national security interests, or whether we are going to act on a different and substantially different agenda. Regime change is code for an American ground invasion of Iraq for the purposes of destroying Saddam Hussein and his government, occupying the country, pacifying the country, and recreating the country in our own image. I have been doing democracy for 25 years, and I can tell you that the democracy business is really tough sledding. It is even tougher when you try and impose democracy at the point of a bayonet. It is, in my judgment, a bridge too far, and it is not in our interest to use our precious resources, our 250,000 soldiers, our treasure, and our political capital, and our standing as a global leader in this fashion. Those who talk about this, and it is a very small cabal in Washington, have driven the policy. This is not a demand-side war. United States citizens that I have spoken to outside the Beltway are ambivalent at best and generally not understanding as to why we would use our most precious asset, our military, in such a cavalier fashion. Questions are beginning to be asked, but unfortunately a good part of the debate has already taken place. It has taken place, it took place, it has been in place, the debate, for the past 10 years. Ever since we ended the Gulf War and began to work through the United Nations to implement subsequent resolutions, there has been a small cabal of zealots in Washington who have been driving an agenda designed to overthrow Saddam Hussein, not because he has weapons of mass destruction, not because he may or may not be linked to terrorism, but because they want to establish a beachhead in the Arab world from which to work to change the political map of the Arab world and essentially ensure Israel 75 more years of security by enfeebling the Arab governments that are arrayed against it. The thesis is that we will go in and we will get rid of Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein is a threat to Israeli security, and he is. There is no doubt about it. Saddam Hussein does help fund some of these Palestinian terrorist movements. Saddam Hussein is a zealot supporter of the Palestinian Authority in all of its manifestations and all of the subgroups that have wreaked so much terror in Israel. There is no doubt about that. Nonetheless, the thesis here is that if you overthrow Saddam Hussein, then you can assert additional pressure on other Arab governments who might be adamantly opposed to Israeli policies or to Israel as a sovereign state. And that the thesis goes on, if you replace Saddam Hussein with a Western-style democracy, then the Western-style democracy of Iraq will find that it has more in common with the Western-style democracy of Israel, and the differences between Arabs and Jews will be subsumed under the commonality of their Western democratic values, and they will be more inclined to make peace between and amongst them. Shorthand for this is the road to Middle East peace goes through Baghdad. In my judgment, and the judgment of a lot of people who do this for a living, including those people who have been involved in the mediation effort for any number of years, the Middle East peace process still goes through Jerusalem and will for the foreseeable future. The problem with this thesis is that if it is wrong, you are almost guaranteed that the friction between Arabs and Jews will be in fact enhanced and heightened over time. Unless, of course, what the cabal that is doing this is really interested in is not democracy in the Arab world, but really the creation of a number of Bantustans in the Arab world, which will have no power, which will have no voice, which will have no way of asserting their independence whatsoever. And that will not happen. The demographics are all against it. How did we get here? These people have been, and I will name the names, but you've all seen them because they have been on every news broadcast since September 12th of 2001. You start with Ken Edelman and Richard Pearl, Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Frank Gaffney, my particular favorite, a guy I love to debate on television. And their thesis has been really rather simple. Their thesis up until September 10th of 2001 was a fringe part of our policy debate. Their thesis was essentially to use an American desire to see regime change in Iraq as a rationale for military action. Now, the United States has had, successive American governments have had regime change policies in place from time immemorial. We have long had a regime change policy in place for Libya, for example. We've long had a regime change policy in place for Cuba, for example. Recently, during the German elections, one could argue that the Bush administration had a regime change policy in place for Germany. They didn't like Mr. Schroeder, and that, of course, became apparent. In fact, those of us in California could legitimately conclude that this administration has long had a regime change policy in place for Gray Davis. That does not mean, however, hopefully, that Mr. Bush is going to mass 250,000 troops on the border of California in order to effect that change. It means that he might do other things. There might be policies that disadvantage Gray Davis. There might be policies that disadvantage Fidel Castro. There might be policies that disadvantage Saddam Hussein. But it is a far cry to espouse regime change and be willing to send 250,000 soldiers to conquer, decapitate, occupy, pacify, and try and recreate as a democracy the sovereign nation of Iraq in a region that is at best ambivalent to our interests and at worst very hostile to a number of our policies. But these people have done that. On September 10th, their policy was a fringe part of the policy debate. Everybody understood we'd be better off without Saddam Hussein. Nobody was prepared to assume that being without Saddam Hussein was worth 250,000 American troops and up to $200 billion, as this war may well cost. September 11th occurred. On September 12th, these people very callously seized the opportunity to make the case that, based on the simple thesis that September 11th was a horrible event, Saddam Hussein is a horrible man, ergo two horribles equal kill Saddam Hussein. And that has been the driving thesis for this ever since. If you've read Bob Woodward's book, he makes very clear that within 2 days of September 11th, Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz were trying to figure out ways to use September 11th as a way to get at Saddam Hussein and affect this policy of regime change. Not because Saddam Hussein had anything to do with September 11th, not because we were worried about weapons of mass destruction, not because we were worried about a potential link-up between Saddam Hussein and terrorist groups, all of which may or may not occur, but because they wanted to affect a long-standing ideology that regime change and redrawing the political map in the Middle East would benefit what their vision of our national security interests are, and in particular, our responsibilities for the territorial integrity and the national security of our ally, our close ally, Israel, which are legitimate responsibilities and which are responsibilities that we have held dear since the creation of the Israeli state. And we should not deny that, and we should not shy away from that. Our policies have historically in the Middle East been based on two pillars, two fundamental pillars. There's other ones as well. But one is we are the best ally of Israel, and two, we are the bridge between Israel and its Arab and often adversarial Arab neighbors. We don't need to shy away from that. It is a legitimate American policy. It is one that has been with us for 50 years. It's one that will be with us for the foreseeable future. The driving force of this argument has one that is surprisingly to me captured the imagination of the President in ways that I'm very, frankly, quite surprised about. At the beginning, the President made clear in his early meetings that this was not about Iraq, this was about the war on terrorism. He beat back ideas in the first few days to include Iraq in this. And then after Afghanistan went rather well, despite the fact that we were unable to find a one-eyed mullah and a 6'4" Arab in Afghanistan, nonetheless, the campaign was largely successful. And the fact that we still, some of us still remember Osama bin Laden, the fight is really against al-Qaeda, and the fight is against terrorism, and not just against a single individual. So I don't deny them that. Why then did we move into Iraq? And there are any number of various suppositions. But why then in particular have we been able to, or how rather, have we been able to marry up some of the inconsistencies, not just between the political philosophy of the Republican Party and this administration and its actions in Iraq, but also its approach to Iraq and its approach to Iraq? For example, on the one hand, we can't deter Saddam, they say. On the other hand, what will he do if you attack? Will he use his weapons of mass destruction against us and our troops? No, he will be deterred. On the one hand, we know as Republicans, big government doesn't know how to build schools in Peoria. On the other hand, can you rebuild Iraq? Sure, no sweat. On the one hand, the biggest threat to American security is the axis of evil, and the protagonists of that axis of evil, we all know: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. On the other hand, North Korea, that does possess a couple of nuclear weapons, is a country we can talk to and do business with. You see the gist. We do not have to do regime change. We do not have to invade Iraq. We do not have to deploy 250,000 of our troops to occupy Baghdad, fight a ground war, kill a lot of Iraqi civilians in the air assault that precedes it, occupy Iraq for a decade in order to achieve the goals that the President has articulated since August, and that is disarmament. There is a body of UN Security Council resolutions out there that talk to the whole disarmament question. There are several hundred inspectors in Iraq, right as we speak, engaging in these inspections. There is the credible threat of force that is arrayed around Iraq right now to ensure that the inspectors are able to do their job, and if they're not able to do their job, that there is sufficient military assets in place to ensure that the 1,000 sites that Hans Blix has identified as potential interest to him can be hit at will, if necessary, to get Saddam's attention. The argument that I have made repeatedly is that disarmament should be the objective. Disarmament is something that the United Nations has supported, most recently in Resolution 1441. The credible threat of force, because Saddam is such a bad man and because the only way that you can deal with him is to be tougher than he is. He is a man, if you try to compromise with him, he will take that as a concession, pocket it, and move on to the next vulnerability that he perceives in his negotiating opponents. So you have to be tough, but you have to be reasoned as well. So the argument that I put forth is that if you keep disarmament as your objective, and you keep the United Nations as the vehicle through which you do disarmament, all that you really need to do is ensure that the inspection regime is not broken. And the inspection regime broke in 1998. It is now repaired. The inspectors can do their job unfettered. It is unreasonable for anybody to assume that Iraq is going to do any more than passively cooperate. People talk about the smoking gun and the need for Iraq to be proactive. And yes, it would be helpful if Iraq were proactive, and we should continue to insist upon it. But realistically speaking, no sovereign government is going to open up its most sensitive secrets to the United Nations. And we need to remember in all of this that Iraq did not build weapons of mass destruction because the United States was an enemy. Iraq built weapons of mass destruction because it was surrounded by a nuclear-armed Israel, a Turkey that had occupied it for 400 years, that has 75 million people in it, and an Iran with which it's been at war for the last 150 years, which also has twice the population of Iraq. Saddam or no Saddam, there is still going to be a desire amongst the national security apparatus to have weapons that allow a relatively small population to defend itself against larger, rapacious neighbors and aggressive neighbors. We should be under no illusion about that. What we do have on our side, we have the fact that Saddam is a serial offender of UN Security Council resolutions, and we should continue to maintain the pressure on him to see that he disarms. Let me conclude, because I know that there are a lot of questions. I wanted to keep this short. My basic position on this is no need to invade, certainly not desirable from our national security perspective to occupy the great country of Iraq. Occupation will breed resistance. It will be a quagmire that will drain our treasury. It will cost Iraqis many, many lives. Iraqis will not like it, even if in the first few days they're elated, because Iraqis will remember that it was 12 years of sanctions that has caused Iraqi citizens to have to sell their family heirlooms in order to survive. Occupation, once they realize the parameters of it and their margin of maneuver, will begin to breed resistance in a way that will be antithetical to our interests within Iraq. Doing it alone in occupation of Iraq, doing it alone, will erode our position as a global leader. We should not see ourselves as the world's only remaining superpower striding across the stage. We should see ourselves, and we should be worried more of the possibility that the rest of the world views us as Jonathan Swift's Gulliver, and the Lilliputs will try and tie us down as best they can. On the other hand, we should be under no illusion that Saddam will voluntarily disarm. We should be under no illusion that somehow he is going to become a calm and defanged leader. We need to ensure that, having once again summoned the international will to confront him on disarmament issues, we should be prepared to give the inspection regime every opportunity to succeed, and we should be prepared to support the inspection regime with military assets as necessary. Those assets should be deployed in such a way that the focus is going after his sites of weapons of mass destruction and not necessarily his regime. And there is a real deterrent reason, in addition to the other reasons I've outlined, to do that, because as Bill Clinton once said, if Saddam Hussein knows he's toast, why wouldn't he use every weapon in his arsenal to defend himself? And he will. He will do a number of things. He will use weapons of mass destruction against American troops. He may well create a humanitarian disaster by using them against his own people. That is not beyond the realm of possibility. He will most certainly try and draw Israel into a broader war, which he can then characterize as the Iraqi defense of the Arab nation against a Judeo-Christian crusade. These are not great outcomes for us. Finally, I'll just quote a friend of mine who was actually is a scholar. I love the title of adjunct scholar, because anybody who knows me knows that I may be an adjunct, but I'm no scholar. When anyone thinks this was Ian Lustig, who was a University of Pennsylvania political science. When anyone thinks of an imperial vision in Western civilization, they think of Rome. They may not think consciously, but they're thinking of Rome, and that's where the phrase Pax Americana, that's why the phrase Pax Americana is all in the newspapers. It's a variation of the Pax Romana. Well, that's good, but let's think about what Mesopotamia meant for Rome. Which Roman emperor conquered Mesopotamia? Trajan. It was a catastrophe for Rome. He conquered it, and they were stuck with it on the edge of the Parthian Empire for half a century, before finally one of the great Roman emperors, Hadrian, realizing that this was a cancer within the empire and a huge risk to his own future, facing down revolts by patriotic generals, withdrew from Mesopotamia. What a contortion it required inside Rome to correct a drastic mistake made by an expansionary move, made because it was possible. But there was really only one thing that Rome got out of Mesopotamia. One thing that Trajan and his soldiers brought back to Rome, and that was the plague. I don't think we want to get involved in this quagmire. We don't want to bring the plague back. At a recent symposium chaired by former Secretary Jim Schlesinger at the Nixon Center in Washington, and made up largely of neoconservatives, Charles Krauthammer advanced his coming ashore thesis that by our military action we would bring democracy to the poor benighted souls of Arabia. I offered, I was invited pretty much as a skunk at the party, comic relief for these guys. I offered that sitting there, I felt like one of Napoleon's generals sitting around the table the night that the decision was made to march to Moscow. Jim Schlesinger responded that it was more like the night before the Battle of Austerlitz, the high point of Napoleon's imperial ambition. Austerlitz, of course, led to Moscow, which led to his ultimate downfall. We should really, truly heed the lessons of imperial overreach as we go forward in this adventure. Thank you.
Ambassador Wilson is frequently on CNN. He's a regular on the Paul Azan show. You can see him regularly.
4 o'clock in the morning.
4 o'clock in the morning. And he'll be respond to questions now for the next 20 minutes or so. You have a question, sir? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Leah Vallejo. I'm the founder and director of BecomeTheChange.org, one of the approximately 25 organizations around the world that are organizing, probably as of now, 1,000 to 1,200 individuals who are actively readying to go to Iraq to form a massive international voluntary human shield in Iraq. It seems that we have become... Thank you. I'm wearing, actually, just as an aside, this shirt, I Love New York, and a little button that I'm sure you can't see from David Krieger of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, which is Choose Hope. I'm wearing these things because I am going to Iraq, or actually by way of London, as soon as possible to join the Universal Kinship Society. I'll keep this brief. What I want to know is, we all seem to think that as we step in to defend a nation of innocent people who will be termed merely casualties with a shrug of the shoulder, in the order of tens or hundreds of thousands, as we step in to defend these people, not its leader, but this people, we expect that the nations of the world will step in to defend us. And we expect that, it seems from interviews that we've had from individuals who've returned recently from Iraq, that this people knows, unlike Americans, this group of people, Iraqis, know to distinguish a nation of people from their government. What I want to know from you, sir, is what do you think the response of the Iraqi people and government will be? How safe do you think this mission is, and how effective?
I think your mission is very dangerous, first of all. I think that if you do that, you will find that you are not credible to the American opinion makers, unfortunately. We used to have a number of people come to Baghdad when we had the hostages there, and Saddam used to manipulate their presence there for his ends. And he would dribble out a couple of hostages every time somebody came. And we discouraged them from coming for just those reasons. At the same time, we were obviously elated every time an American was freed. But I think you need to understand that you will be not well seen by your own government and not credible in this debate when you're over there, and that you will be manipulated by Saddam for his own purposes, and he is a bad man, and that your lives will be very much in danger as human shields. Now, as to the question about Iraqi people, despite all of this, Iraqi people have an abiding affection for Americans. I suspect that we can rebuild that affection. It will be seriously eroded, however, if we have an invasion that results in the deaths of many, many Iraqi civilians. And if you've seen the reports from the United Nations from the last war, they estimate that there were up to 500,000 casualties in Iraq. You don't see that in anything that we publish, but the United Nations has published it. I would urge you rather to be part of the debate here and to continue to try and influence your representatives in your government here in the States. But I admire you if you're an American citizen, if you have to do what you have to do.
One further question, perhaps more rhetorical, sir, and that is, do you suppose at this fragile moment in history, unwilling to have this war, doing everything he can, swallowing his pride. This is an arrogant man we're talking about. Do you suppose that Saddam Hussein, who has already opened his doors to the inspections, which is a humiliating move on his part, would want to touch any of the shield who come to protect him in the face of the world, which he knows might stand up to defend him or thrash him severely?
Yeah, when you're there and when the U.S. military is moving into Baghdad, you might well find yourselves being in a position that is not one that you really want to be in, where your life will be in danger.
I'm Robert Potter of the Campus Community for Peace Group. I wanted to say to the audience, if you'd like to meet with Ambassador Wilson tomorrow in a slightly more intimate situation, he's going to be at the Multicultural Center from 12 to 2 for a discussion and question and answer session. I hope some of you will come to that. My question, sir, is, and I think was the saddest part of what you had to say, was that the debate is almost over rather than beginning. I'd like, if you could, to account for the fact that there was so little debate, the way in which this policy, which you so aptly described to us, was simply never adequately debated.
Yeah. Well, I think a good part of that has to do with the trauma that we all felt here after September 11th, and the ability of this small group to seize that opportunity to advance their agenda. As somebody was pointing out today at lunch, now more than half of the American population believe that it was Iraqis who were in the majority in those airplanes that hit the towers and hit the Pentagon, which it wasn't. There was not a single Iraqi therein. But they have managed to distort through their really, truly aggressive efforts what our policy should be towards Iraq and what our objectives should be, seizing the opportunity presented in a rather callous way as a consequence of the national trauma after 9/11. The debate, of course, then was handled before the elections for political reasons. And somebody asked me to mention Karl Rove. Karl Rove was clearly in charge of the campaign, getting the debate on the agenda in Congress before the elections forced Democrats to make decisions that were probably ill-considered, both for timing perspectives and political perspectives, and also for strategic perspectives. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I came out of Baghdad, and I met with the senior leadership of both parties, and to a man, from George Bush Sr. to the senior leadership of the Democratic Party, everybody had plumbed the depths of their consciences in making the decision to support the United States going to war against Iraq to liberate Kuwait. And that was a just and justifiable war. This time, you had the Democrats rolling over playing dead, and you had Tom Daschle, who made, I think, the very unfortunate statement that let's get this vote out of the way now so we can move on to things more important. There is nothing more important than the prospect of sending your army on an expeditionary force a long way away and putting them in danger in an operation that should actually be the last option and not the first option.
Next question.
In regards to skepticism over the possibility of affecting regime change in Iraq, it seems that most of the people who are supporting it tend to point to the examples of Germany and Japan after the Second World War as basically evidence that you can effectively install a democratic government. I mean, especially in the example of Japan, where it wasn't necessarily there previously. I mean, basically it's given as evidence that this type of thing can be done and it can be done well. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. In the case of both Germany and Japan, first of all, the societies were considerably different from the Iraqi society. The Germans had solved all their questions of ethnic problems within their various groupings well before the Second World War. Secondly, we were drawn into these wars by aggressive actions taken by both the Germans and the Japanese. Certainly in the case of the Japanese, we brought democracy not at the point of a bayonet, but at the cost of a couple of nuclear weapons. So they were truly, truly vanquished in ways that are just very horrible to contemplate. And also in the case of Japan, as a consequence of that of their having been utterly defeated, the emperor made certain decisions which his society was then compelled to abide by. That will not be the case in Iraq. In the case of Germany, we have a common history, and we have sort of a lot of common bonds. It was an industrial society. There were a bunch of different agendas that played there in the aftermath of the Second World War. But, and, you know, in all fairness, perhaps we can spend 45, 50 years there in Iraq. Maybe that's what we want to do, because that's what it took, and we're still there in both Japan and Germany.
Two quick questions. I've often heard it said that we were sending mixed signals to the Iraqis prior to the invasion of Kuwait, from our government through our State Department, often attributed to a
April
lady
Glaspie.
that I can't remember her
Yeah,
name.
April Glaspie. She was the ambassador. I was just Mark gave me a promotion, but I was the deputy chief of mission and acting, we call it chargé d'affaires in our business, but she was the president's personal representative to Iraq, and she was out of the country when the invasion of Kuwait took place. But yeah, it's April Glaspie. And your second question, or do you want me to ask?
Second question is, I'd like you to comment on the history and legality of the no-fly zones.
Okay. Well, let me talk about April first. Yeah, there is, I mean, she will go down, unfortunately, in American history as a scapegoat in this exercise. And I think the history has been written that, and it's in every journalist's files, and that's what they're going to rely on writing these stories, that somehow she gave Saddam something less than a red light. In fact, when she met with Saddam on July 26, she had no specific instructions, contrary to what U.S. and, in fact, Western policy on Arab disputes has been since time immemorial. And that is that we take no position on the merits of the particular case, but we do urge you in the strongest possible fashion to resolve them through either international tribunals and courts or through a diplomatic process, and certainly not through invading your neighboring country. Even Tariq Aziz, who, as I like to say about Tariq Aziz, one of my principal interlocutors, he's a man who is clearly far more articulate and far brighter than I am or ever will be, and he can spin out a tale with the best of them. But like a used car salesman, would you trust that man? And I wouldn't, but I think he speaks true when he says that Saddam Hussein was not, in fact, looking for a green light, yellow light, or red light from April Glaspie when he met her. My own take on that, his meeting with her and then his meeting with me on August 6th, was that he wanted to avoid the possibility of a U.S. unilateral reaction, which is what he feared. I think he made the roll of the dice of the invasion of Kuwait was done with his own experience with international organizations firmly in mind. And I think that he thought that if he could avoid a U.S. unilateral reaction and get this thing thrown into the United Nations, that he would have just as long in Kuwait as Israel's had in defying resolutions 242 and 338, which is his historical reference point. And that would have been 20, 25 years to move Kuwaitis out, Iraqis in, pump the oil, loot the treasury, and then have a referendum. What he was worried about was B-52s coming over. He made that clear to me in our meeting on August 6th. And as to the legality of the no-fly zones, you hear Don Rumsfeld in particular talking about how they are now in material breach every time they shoot at them, but you also would notice that they use as justification for that material breach allegation, Resolution 1441. Nobody is prepared to go back and argue that prior to 1441, which was the most recent resolution on Iraq, that these no-fly zones in the American and British efforts in no-fly zones are consistent with any UN Security Council resolution that has been passed. They will make the assertion, but they won't go to the UN and argue it. And they're not going to go to the UN, I don't believe, and argue that the shooting of aircraft is in violation of 1441. That may bubble up because the Iraqis in the last couple of days have said that they cannot ensure the security of UN U-2s, which are the other spy planes that they want to fly over.
Hi, I'm Carol Delaney. I'm an anthropologist from Stanford, down here visiting for the day. And I have a couple of things. One I would like your comments on, and the other one I would like to make a comment. I was in Iraq with several academics just before the Gulf War. And one of the questions that I have is, it seemed to me months before the invasion, there were a lot of complaints by Saddam Hussein and other Iraqi officials that Kuwait was illegally siphoning off oil from their joint oil fields, and that nobody in the administration seemed to be paying any attention to that. And so it seemed to me that had we paid attention, perhaps the invasion might never have occurred. At least when I was there, it was in April before anything happened. It did not at all seem that that was even in the works from the people that I talked to. So I want your comments on that. But
You should have come to see me then. I'd have given you all the comments.
Were you? I don't know if you were there. We met with
there.
April Glaspie and Tariq Aziz and all the rest of them. But the other question or comment I have is that it seems to me when you talk about evil governments, one of the things that nobody seems to take into account is the issue of gender. From my own experience, I think Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, as a woman, are just as repressive, if not more horrible. I would rather be a woman living in Iraq, even now, than I would to be a woman living in either Saudi Arabia or in Kuwait.
Okay.
So I'd like your comments on that.
All right. Well, first of all, I think it is irrespective of what the United States might or might not have been doing to actively mediate the assertion on the part of the Iraqis that Kuwait was slant drilling into the southern Rumaila oil fields. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was not an American operation. It was not countenanced by the United States. The United States had no role to play in it. It was something that was strictly between the Kuwaitis and the Iraqis. And if you want to sort of figure out the who lost Kuwait debate, then what you really ought to take a look at is the Kuwaiti efforts at the negotiating session when the Iraqis brought down Izzat Ibrahim, Taha Ramadan, and Ali Hassan al-Majid as their negotiators, three of the biggest thugs in the regime. These were not guys who were down there to invite some deal with the Kuwaitis. These were guys who were down there to tell the Kuwaitis what the deal was going to be, and when the Kuwaitis missed that signal, they were invaded. We take the blame for a lot of stuff, but I don't think we take the blame for the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. As to gender, I don't disagree with you. Iraq is one of these very interesting countries, as you know from your time there. It is not Levantine, but it is not the Gulf. It is a culture somewhere in between. It is not as easygoing as, say, Lebanon, and it is not as discreet and as rigid as the Gulf. Women in Iraq have always had a prominent role to play in the affairs of state and the government and in their civil service and in business, for that matter. My point on all of this is not that we don't make war. We make war for our own national security reasons. We make war when our own national security is threatened. There are other means and other ways to address the concerns that you have.
Most of the people in 9/11 were Saudi Arabians.
I don't
We're
disagree with
friends with
that.
them.
I don't disagree with that, but that was not a Saudi government operation either.
I'm Rich Scholl, just a private citizen, trying to make heads or tails here. And
Me too.
You have
It's nice being a private citizen, I must tell you. I wouldn't be here if I was still in the government. I'd be out flacking for this crap. No, I wouldn't either, probably.
You haven't mentioned oil at all, and I'm interested in.
Yeah, the oil
what
business
your take
is a very interesting one. A lot of people have done some studies on this. And the basic conclusion is that it will take 6 to 7 years for Iraqi petroleum to get up to levels where it might naturally settle, about 6 million barrels a day. It is probably not going to be the market maker because the Saudis have got excess capacity that exceeds what the Iraqi growth in oil production will be over the foreseeable future. In addition to which, of course, there's a lot of oil coming on stream from Russia. And finally, as the idea that there might be some windfall profits for the American exploration and production companies, most of these oil contracts are written in such a way that windfalls generally go to the government contracting agency and not to the oil companies themselves. And most of the money that will come from increased oil production will go to pay off loans and to rehabilitate the oil fields, which are in a dilapidated condition already, even before you get to increasing production. The beneficiaries of this, curiously, of sort of windfall, if you will, might be some of the oil services companies, of which I'll just name a couple. One is Schlumberger, and the other one is a little company called Halliburton. So you draw your own conclusions. You know, $25 million as a payoff to Dick Cheney might have been pretty cheap in the long run.
I have one other question. Do you think George Bush has built in any adequate ability to back down in certain scenarios?
You know, the administration has shown enormous nimbleness, and they've been able to turn on a dime. North Korea is a great example. After having trashed the Clinton administration, they're doing essentially the same thing. Certainly, George Bush was adamant about regime change for many, many months, and then suddenly, one fine day, and I don't know, about the time he went to the United Nations, I guess, he suddenly came out for disarmament. Now, I hold him at that particular word, that this is all about disarmament. So I would think that there are a number of ways that he could execute a policy that will allow him to save the so-called face. And one of the things, of course, that the neoconservatives now put out, and you can see it almost everywhere, that we have to have this war because the president's prestige is on the line. Now, you know, tell that to the mother of some of these Iraqi civilians who are going to get killed in the air assault. Tell it to the mother or father or of American soldiers who are going to be over there. We had to do this war because the president's prestige was at stake. I don't buy that particular argument. I think that, that what I call muscular disarmament or coercive containment is one that allows the United States to take the moral high ground because it will be sustained by the United Nations and save us from a real potential quagmire and one that we just don't know. The one thing about war, the only thing you know about, really about how wars are going to pan out, the only thing you can be sure of is when you fire the first shot. Everything else is really up in the air. And I would prefer that these guys don't fire the first shot on either side.
Joe, we have about 3 questions. I'm sorry, the person who just came up. Let's stick with the 3 people on this side and the 3 people on this side. And if the questions are succinct,
I'm more than happy to stay around and answer questions privately for a few more minutes.
But if these questions are succinct and the answers are reasonably so, we can finish up these 3 on either side in the next 5 minutes or so and get out in a reasonable time. How's that sound?
Perfect.
Okay.
I first want to say that I'll have information about the event with Ambassador Wilson outside and other upcoming events. The question, you mentioned that Saddam Hussein is just about the worst thing possible for Iraq, and I'm wondering in that light if you can help us understand the resistance to assist uprisings that have been organized in Iraq, the one namely right after the Gulf War, or the one organized by Robert Baer, an ex-CIA agent in the mid-90s. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, you know, there was a general consensus, and this was really where the last administration probably didn't get it quite right. When Norm Schwarzkopf went into the tents there in Basra, he really didn't have the talking points that could have led to a somewhat different outcome. In particular, we should never allow Iraqi aircraft and helicopters to fly during that period of the uprisings. There was a general consensus among the community and the sort of analytical community in Washington, all the people who pretend to know everything, that the Iraqi regime could not survive this terrible military defeat. They obviously proved us wrong. Now, as to why we didn't specifically offer more assets, we were, of course, operating under the UN Security Council resolution, which said you will expel them from Kuwait, and didn't offer any authorization to do anything else. In the mid-90s, we ran operations in the north. They were not very successful. They were riddled by Iraqi double agents, and of course they were rolled up in the mid-90s, much to our chagrin.
Your question, and please be brief.
Yes, Frontline on TV had a program a few years back called Israel, the Covert Connection, in which it was revealed that the United States was secretly in collusion with Israel in the '67 war. And that's been borne out by the fact that they're still occupying the land they took, and that our tax dollars are funding settling hundreds of thousands of settlers in those lands. So obviously the double standard is pretty glaring around the world. Now I want to ask, my question is, do you really think this massive buildup is only regarding Iraq, or is it really regarding knowing that if we go into Iraq, it's going to cause an incendiary reaction throughout the Arab world under the umbrella of which Israel will expand into Syria and Lebanon, as many articles I brought here from the Christian Science Monitor suggest?
Yeah, there's a whole school of thought out there that they call the one country over theory, and it is debated much more avidly within Israel than it is in the United States. And the theory goes as follows. When we go into Iraq, we will begin to emphasize that Iraq is a terrorist nation, and Sharon and the Likud government will embrace our war on terrorism by running their own war against Palestinian terrorists, and will move to push as many Palestinians out of Gaza and the occupied territories into Jordan as they possibly can. And the theory, the shorthand for this is called one country over, and it goes, Palestine is Israel, Jordan is Palestine, and Iraq is Jordan. And basically what that means is that Israel will then, the Likud dream of Judea and Samaria will be achieved by driving the Palestinians out into Jordan. The Hashemites will no longer be able to rule in Jordan because it will be so overwhelmingly Palestinian that they will have to cede power to Palestinians, Jordan will then become the effective Palestinian state. and there's got to be a place for the Hashemites, so they will restore them to the throne that they occupied in Iraq prior to 1958. I don't know. They certainly worry about this in Jordan. I would come back to what I said earlier. My own sense of this is that those who believe that this is somehow going to enhance Israel's security are probably wrong, and that, in fact, the road to peace, a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, still goes through Jerusalem and does not go through Baghdad. Certainly, the principal artery of that road is not through Baghdad. But that's all out there, and certainly there are a lot of people who are concerned about it.
Brief question. What about this far away?
My name is Radu.
There you go.
Sorry. My name is Radu Iliescu. I'm a UCSB undergrad student in history. I have a brother in the Air Force, Whiteman Air Force Base on the B-2 bomber. And my question to you is, what happened on September 11th is basically actions of what happened in the Persian Gulf War. Looks like because of what that happened in Persian Gulf War, we had actions on September 11th about a year and a half ago. What do you think will happen if we do go into Iraq and we do pose war upon these Arab nations? Will we have more attacks, more terrorist attacks against the U.S. and Israel? What do you see in the future? And my last question is, what can we as Americans do to stop this war?
Yeah. Okay, first of all, I really see September 11th more as a continuation of the events of, say, Beirut when they blew up the Marine barracks. It was essentially an attack on American assets to drive us from maintaining a presence in Saudi Arabia so that Osama bin Laden and his crowd could then more easily assume power and foment the revolution in Saudi Arabia. So I think it's our presence in Saudi Arabia more than the Persian Gulf War in and of itself that brought us September 11th. I do think that we run the very real risk, particularly if we go into this unilaterally and without sort of international support, of essentially spawning several more generations of disaffected Arabs who will become terrorists and will kill Americans and will die on behalf of a martyred Saddam Hussein, and it's something we ought to be really worried about. Finally, what can you do? My own sense is that the best thing you can do, first let me tell you what I don't think you should do. I think you should be reasoned and principled in your approach to anti-war, and I've said this to the Win Without War people, that you need to recognize that Saddam Hussein is a bad man. You need to stipulate at the beginning, Saddam Hussein is a bad man. This is not about whether Saddam is good or bad. This is about what is in Americans' national interest, what we should do. And secondly, I think that you need to conduct yourselves in a way that emphasizes reasoned debate. Now, I take great offense. I think it gives the anti-war movement a bad name when a bunch of protesters get naked and form a peace symbol on a Hollywood hill. And even if it is something good to do, it is perceived by those who are on the other side of the debate as being not credible. And it diminishes people who are credible and believe strongly that what we're doing is the wrong thing to do. So those are the sorts of things that I would suggest. I've told the Win Without War people that there are a couple of things that we ought to be able to do in a complementary fashion, but I could not sign the letter. One, it did not say in the very beginning that Saddam Hussein is a menace to the region. It did not identify him as a real problem. And two, it did not leave any room for the possibility of military action in support of a UN inspection regime. And then three, of course, those people, the Win Without War people, or as Sean Hannity would say, the Hollywood liberals, are saddled with the Jane Fonda problem, which I'm not.
Yes.
My name is Kristen Galbraith, and I'm a global studies student, and I have that cotton mouth thing you were talking about. I just have a couple questions. Could you just clarify for me, since we were so familiar with Saddam's human rights record, as well as his weapons of mass destruction, why didn't we take care of him 12 years ago in the justifiable war? And also,
I'm sorry?
in the war, the first Gulf War that you called
right.
justifiable, and also keeping in mind the agenda that those in the Bush administration have as far as regime change goes in Iraq. If September 11th had not occurred, how do you think they would have gone about that?
Sure.
By rallying?
All right, your second question first. If September 11th had never occurred, this still would be a fringe part of the policy debate. there would still be a few people out there saying the only way to deal with Saddam Hussein is to invade Iraq. They would not have gotten traction in this administration. They would not have had the opportunity that was presented to them by the September 11th events. In your second question, there were a number of reasons why we were unable to go in and take care of Saddam. The first and foremost being that the UN Security Council resolution that allowed us to form a vast coalition, not just of political will, but also of military assets. The coalition, the UN Security Council resolution was very specific that the objective was to expel him from Kuwait. Secondly, so going beyond the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border, you would have had members of that coalition dropping like flies, including the French, the Germans, and the French and the Russians, and we would have lost Chinese support. So that would have been main UN Security Council support. We would have lost all the Arabs on that coalition. Every step on the way of Baghdad, we either would have killed a lot of Iraqi civilians or there would have been more American troops killed. And people say, well, it was so easy, all the Iraqis gave up. Well, they gave up because they were in Kuwait. It would have been a far different story going through Kabul and Najaf and on the way to Baghdad. Thirdly, when we got there, we probably would not have found Saddam Hussein, and we'd have been stuck administering an extraordinarily difficult country, the same sort of thing that we're going to face if we go there this time. And then fourthly, there's the argument that has been put forth by a number, which was never anything that I discussed either with Brent Scowcroft or President Bush himself, and that was that you didn't want to completely destroy the Iraqi army because you do need, in the judgment of many, you need to have a strong deterrent force to curb Iranian regional ambition.
My name is Lily Schiff. I'm a foreigner. I'm an American citizen, but I was born in Europe. And I'm becoming slightly paranoid. I looked in the mirror the other day and I realized my eyes are black. Am I going to be suspected of being a terrorist because my eyes are dark? Secondly, I'm quite puzzled. Isn't that a double standard that it was okay to attack Iraq because Iraq had invaded Kuwait? I'm convinced that Kuwait has a lot of oil, and this is why it happened. Why would it be all right for America to attack Iraq? And I think that Americans can be pretty in denial. I saw no victory or glory in the war in Vietnam. No, America did not win the war in Vietnam. No, America did not win the war in the Gulf War. And my question is also, would we be in this predicament if Mr. Bush père had finished what he was supposed to have been doing?
All right.
Okay, let's have the answers to the questions. Thank
First,
you very
your
much.
first question, if you're feeling a little paranoid, I'm right with you. As John Ashcroft rewrites the Constitution by edict every Monday morning when he comes to the office, I think we all should be worried about the erosion of our civil liberties in the name of the so-called war on terrorism. That's a little bit outside my brief today, of course. But I will say this. I have been in and around Washington since Gerald Ford was president. And this is, in my judgment, and I've said this at the most senior levels of the Democratic Party, this is the most dangerous administration that I have ever seen. Having said that, when I said that, somebody said, well, I've been in Washington since Kennedy and Johnson, and I don't think it is. Well, maybe John Kennedy, maybe Lyndon Johnson were more dangerous. That's, after all, we went to Vietnam with them. With respect to the double standard of going to defend Kuwait as a consequence of an Iraqi invasion for oil and yet invading Iraq for the purposes of oil, again, I would try and make the point once again that in my judgment, the appropriate action towards Iraq is to defend those UN Security Council resolutions that are in place, and those are all related to disarmament. And I guarantee you that the French are never going to allow a UN Security Council resolution that says that use of all force can be applied for the purposes of overthrowing the regime of a member state of the United Nations. So the resolution will be one that says use of all force to enforce disarmament. The question then will be whether or not the Bush administration will be prepared to live with that resolution and the constraints that that resolution will impose upon our actions. And thirdly, with respect to Bush père, of course, he did live within the resolution that was passed, and that resolution was very specific that the objective of the use of all necessary force was to expel Saddam from Kuwait, not to go in, conquer, overthrow the government, occupy.
And
The United Nations has served American foreign policy interests ever since it was created. If it is impotent, it is because we and the other members of the United Nations have opted to limit its power and its authority. My own sense is that going forward, it is probably a very good institution, and certainly it is there. And I think that other countries will find it in their interest to maintain a strong United Nations, not because it will continue to do American bidding, but because in our brief period as the world's only remaining superpower, we have made a lot of nations very nervous, and the United Nations may serve as a way to constrain what they fear are our aggressive behavior.
we have the last question now. You've been very patient. And Joe, in answering, please feel free to wrap things up.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, I'm also an immigrant of foreign descent. So I've lived overseas, and I was very grateful that the war ended with the United States participation in 1945 with the dropping of an atomic bomb. That ended the Japanese occupation under which I was living. So, as far as I know, Americans per se have not gone to war willingly. And I'm not here to defend American foreign policy, but there is another side. If I remember, Mr. Ambassador, during the campaign that George Bush had in 2000, he had criticized President Clinton's involvement, American involvement in Bosnia, and he had no place for nation building. He said so. He's now, since 9/11, he has found himself in a position of being involved from being a neophyte in foreign affairs into being involved head over heels in formulating even a war.
And your question for Ambassador
So
Wilson?
essentially, I have some questions which you may answer. If the rest of the world had been in consensus in condemning Saddam Hussein and claiming that he is actually a war criminal for all the crimes that he had committed to Kuwait and also to his own citizens, would he not have been forced out of power? Would it be easily done better that way if the rest of the world had condemned Saddam Hussein? One. Two, you were talking about regime change, but if you don't have regime change, would that not be a status quo? And if it's a status quo, what's the difference between now and 10 years from now when Saddam is still in power?
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, first of all, in 1998, when we withdrew the inspectors and then launched the operation of Desert Fox, the operation of Desert Fox was only 4 days long, but it was extraordinarily effective. It went after sites of weapons of mass destruction and the command and control centers that supported them, the military aspects that covered them. But it was the last hurrah. And I think you're absolutely right that by that time, the international political will to continue to constrain Saddam Hussein had eroded. utility of what the Bush administration has thus far has done has been that it has been able to resurrect that international political will and gotten the international community to agree that Saddam Hussein is a bad man, something that we have known. Now the question really is, how do you go about doing this? Everybody would like regime change, and I would argue that if regime change comes about as a consequence of an aggressive campaign to disarm him, including hitting the command and control sites that support his weapons of mass destruction facilities this time around. In other words, making it painful enough for the colonels and generals that they make the decision, or they have to decide, whether it is in their interest to storm the palace walls rather than be on the receiving end of U.S. cruise missiles. I think that's fine. We would all applaud that. The departure of Saddam Hussein is something we would all applaud. The question really is it in our national interest to put 250,000 troops in Iraq unilaterally or with limited support for the purposes of overthrowing the regime and then subsequently occupying and trying to remake the regime in our own image, which is an extraordinarily, as the anthropologist who was here will confirm, it's an extraordinarily difficult process to do. That is really this is not a defense of Saddam Hussein that you're hearing here. As I know Saddam Hussein, and he is not a likable guy. This is really an effort to begin a discussion, which is long overdue, on what is in U.S. vital national security interests in terms of our actions. Let me just say that I began speaking out on this issue in July of last year on the Paula Zahn show. And she asked me what I thought, and I said, gee, I think that maybe regime change is not what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about disarmament. We should be thinking about fixing the mechanism to enforce the resolutions on weapons of mass destruction. And Paula was very nice and very kind, but she was also very dismissive. Thank you very much. That's one man's opinion, and I didn't hear from her again. And this is when Wolfowitz and Pearl and all these guys really commanded the airwaves. And a couple of months later, George Bush comes out, it was Crawford, and he says, guess what? Disarmament is the objective of the U.S. government. He had dropped regime change completely from his lexicon, and to this day, you have not heard him talk about regime change. He has talked about disarmament or forcible disarmament. Since then, Paula's had me on for breakfast about once or twice a week. Unfortunately, you don't get to see it out here unless you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I would not encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to go ahead and have the lives that you have. I would say, however, that you can assume that if there is something good on television, the premiere of West Wing, the Super Bowl, National Football League playoffs, something like that, you can probably assume I'm on another channel because I am always on a political talk show that nobody ever watches. So the night I was on Hannity and Combs, it was the night of the premiere of West Wing, and not even my wife tuned me in. So.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. The next time something great is on TV, we'll look for you somewhere else. Thank you so much for joining us.